All right, welcome to the Mind Body Business Podcast. Today I have the pleasure of featuring Mr. Don Hammond, multiple C-level exits and serial entrepreneur. How you doing today, Mr. Don?
I'm good, Nicholas. How are you?
Good, good. Living the dream. Like, Mr. Don, to kind of start things off here, let's get into your childhood. Where did you grow up? How was that experience for you? What did your parents do? Your siblings? Tell me about all of that.
Yeah, so obviously you and I had a chance to meet on a previous call for just a few minutes. Um, this is an interesting way of going about podcasting. It really
Yeah.
is. Tell me about your childhood. I feel like I should be leaning
Right.
back on a couch right now,
Yeah.
looking into the ceiling and contemplating where my life went. But
Yeah.
on a more
That's the
serious
goal.
note, look, no, but I think it's a really good question, right? Because obviously we can find out a lot about people when we kind of it when we kind of learn their roots. And for me, like, I was born and raised in the Midwest, pretty straightforward. I would say mostly middle class family. There was certainly nothing special about it. Grew up with two sisters. I think to a certain degree that's kind of important. And the reason I say that is I'm old enough to where when you had siblings at my age, you had to share a lot. And I don't think that happens a lot today.
Right.
Um, you know, kids always had to share a bathroom, if not the entire family type of thing.
Yeah.
They shared bedrooms, that sort of a thing. Whereas now everyone has their own separate everything. It's kind of interesting on how that builds adults.
Sure.
But yeah, blue collar parents. My parents worked. I grew up in the Rust Belt, and
Wow. Okay.
they worked hard. And predominantly I grew up in the '80s. Got the Rust Belt name for a reason.
Yeah.
Things were rough around the edges, and yeah. Look, I think there's that really fine line of kind of how you grew up, who you grew up with. Did I always know I wasn't necessarily dying to run after a blue collar existence? Yeah, I did. I was a pretty sharp kid, and I was good at school and sports and that sort of thing. But I think there's a lot you can learn from that when you kind of cross over.
Absolutely.
My father had a saying when I was young. And of course, I didn't think much of it when I was young, but it kind of always occurs to me back now, and it's always, people are going to want to call you a lot of things in life.
Yeah.
It's like, just make sure they can't call you stupid or lazy.
Yeah.
And I've always kind of
That's
lived by
good.
that. So
That's good.
yeah, middle class, Midwest, pretty awfully straightforward.
Now, you say the Midwest. Where exactly in the Midwest?
I grew up between Wisconsin and Illinois.
Okay. Awesome. Awesome. I ended up doing a flight instructor gig in Ohio, Bell Fountain, Ohio, just west of Columbus, and I really enjoyed that. And on the blue collar stuff, as far as building a work ethic and learning how to work and having that foundation, I would say to this day, my favorite job was my first job. Well, second job. My first job was apprenticing a horse trainer, and that was 7 days a week. We were doing 12 to 16-hour days, and I worked for free, and purely because I wanted to learn the trade. Now, the second job was the first job that I actually got paid for, and that was building fence, and it was by far one of my most favorite jobs that I've ever worked, and I've had a chance to be in a lot of different industries, and just being a 17-year-old kid and being out in the heat and proving to yourself that you can work hard. I thought that it was cool to get up in the morning and be sore and go to work and see if I could work harder than I was yesterday, and then to go to sleep and get up the next day, be even more sore, and see if I could work harder than I did the day before.
You're really hitting on some important points. And so, by the way, I built decks in my teenage
Okay.
years.
Yeah.
And I think, and look, men and women are equal. They're not the same.
Sure.
I think it's important to say that. And
Yeah, that's a good
for
way
young
of putting it.
men, there is something to be said about production.
Yeah.
You know, an average deck would take you 2 to 3 days, and when you walked out there the first day, it was just materials, right? And so
Right.
by the
Yeah.
second day, the footers and everything were done, and then by the third day, you were popping railings over that, and
Right.
there was certainly a sense of accomplishment, right?
Yeah.
Once you got done with that whole thing, and of course, you were getting stronger, and you were getting a tan, and you were getting, there's a bunch of other
Yeah.
fringe
Right.
benefits that went into that,
Yeah.
but there's certainly something. Yeah, look, I was stunned. I remember getting into undergrad, and I rushed a house. It was my sophomore year, or whatever. And I remember, you know, I remember just kind of being stunned at how lots of the guys, when something went wrong at their house, you know, they're like, yeah, my dad just called a plumber, my dad just called an
Yeah.
electrician, my dad just called. I'm like,
Yeah.
never in my growing up, dude, would we have ever called a
Right.
plumber to our house? You know, you
Yeah.
did it. You know, you
Yeah.
fixed it, sort of a thing. So, yeah, there's
That's
something. I mean,
awesome.
don't get me wrong. My dad probably butchered a few things too over the years, but it's one of
Yeah.
those things where I think there's something to be said that if you have a problem, you fix your problem.
Yeah.
And I think there's
There
a bit of
is.
a mentality behind that. Yeah.
Absolutely. And the way that I grew up was the opposite of that. And it's almost like I had this innate understanding of needing to be able to do things on your own. My dad, he's a character and a pilot and never did anything, right? Always hired out, had people come in and do stuff and was never that kind of do it yourself person. And I wonder if that played any role in my young life, really wanting to do some of those blue collar jobs and get my hands dirty.
Being a son is funny, right? I think you only end up doing two options. You either end up being just like your father or the
Mm,
polar opposite of your father.
yeah.
I haven't
Mm.
met people who are kind of like 8 degrees off of their fathers. Like
Right, right, right.
usually either right smack dab right back where
Yeah,
the dad is, or they are the polar opposite.
yeah.
I'm not sure about daughters and mothers. I'm trying to think of my sisters and my mom right now, but certainly I think, or at least at the very least, there's characteristics
Yeah.
that, certainly there's some things I'm very much like my father, and there are things that, and I think I think as you grow up as a young man, look, everybody's fallible to a certain degree. I think there are aspects of your parents or your mother, or your father, that you don't necessarily want to replicate. Either you don't like it, you
Hmm.
don't respect it, and so you go out of your way to create this almost exact opposite characteristic in yourself.
Right.
Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not, right? Sometimes you
Yeah.
just read things, but I think in the big picture of things, yeah, it's funny. You know, I've got a buddy of mine who went on to do construction. His dad's a surgeon,
Mm.
and
Okay.
he grew up with a
Wow.
father who, under no circumstances, because of his living, could not
Yeah.
use his hands around the house. Right? That
Right.
literally could,
Yeah.
he cuts his finger. Maybe he doesn't work for a month or something.
Right.
And
Right.
so he's been swinging a hammer for 20 plus years. Now, was that out of spite? I don't know, maybe a little bit, but
Right.
I do think there's something to be said about again, going back to your original question, how were you raised? Were you raised? I just think I think it has so much to do with who we are. Um, that being said, I also think we've got to be really clear about not maintaining our childhood our whole lives. When you start meeting
Yes.
people and look, I don't want to get on the whole shrinks couch here, but if you're
It's
if
okay.
you're if you're 50 years old and you're still in a daily routine talking about how your parents treat you, you've got to move on, right? And
Yeah.
and, and I'm just saying
Yeah.
that strictly because you create yourself a prison in there, and
Yeah.
I guess to put that to a tangent in the workplace, you see a lot of people walking around with certain levels of, dare I call it, like a PTSD type of thing from previous jobs,
Yeah.
previous bosses, previous,
Mm.
do yourself a favor, and I mean this in a very sincere way.
Yeah.
Get over it,
Yeah.
because it's not showing you in the best light. And when you walk into
Absolutely.
every relationship, I don't care if it's boy, girl, boy, work,
Yeah.
personal, professional, when you walk into every relationship with these just baggage galore,
Yeah.
it is incredibly unattractive. But
Yeah.
maybe more importantly, from a business perspective, it's remarkably unproductive usually. I
Yeah.
very rarely see people bring in terrible baggage and you go, holy cow, that made us way more efficient. And
Right.
usually never the case.
Yes, absolutely. And we talked about this earlier on our call as far as the younger generation, my generation, um, looking at their bosses as if they were a father figure. And I can say, bringing some of that same baggage into the workplace, right? And I can say without a doubt that I've done that. And I've
Well,
looked
everyone
at,
has to a
right,
certain degree. I mean, I guess it
sure.
depends, like in what ways did you do it?
So, right. So now we're talking about the healing journey that a child will go on to overcome some of the things that their parents did with them or did for them or that they didn't agree about in raising them. And so me particular with my dad being a pilot, all he ever wanted for me was to be a pilot. And I had to go through that process of going through flight training and trying to make my own way. And I ended up getting to a point where I said, I'm not going to be like him, or I'm not going to do these things that he's doing. And mostly out of spite for him. And I know he's not going to watch this podcast, so it's okay.
Win.
A good guy in his own way, right? Where he has an immense capability for leadership. But if he went about it in a way where he really tried to understand people, then he would be a much better leader today than he is. And so, but I've embodied that, right?
Right, but I'm going to play contrarian with you a bit on that one. So,
okay.
Again, there's just difference in ages, right? I'm guessing
Sure.
your father's probably got me by a handful of years. And so, leadership is so different today. Just the word and its meaning behind it. I mean,
Sure.
no offense, I'm of an age. The minute I see someone say they're a servant leader, I just roll my eyes and leave the room, right? So,
Yeah.
But for some people that means a lot. I mean, for your father's age group, I mean, just take it back a step or two. You said, hey, my father wanted me to be a pilot. I would play a little contrarian with you. Did he really want you to be a pilot, or maybe he wanted you to be like him, right? And
it was that one, yeah,
and he's
for
successful.
Sure.
So maybe was he really just saying, I hope my son's successful? It's great if he's a pilot, but maybe it's not. You see what I'm saying? There's little games.
Yeah, absolutely.
Look, one man's heaven's another man's hell. We get to kind of self-manufacture the stories that go on in our head. And
Sure.
I see so many people who go, oh, and A, B, and C happened, and then I can't handle it anymore, and they go. There's just dramatics and all these other things that go on, and I'm like, do you ever think the other person was just having a bad day and they didn't really think about what they said to you? I mean, like the fact that you turned it into drama class 101 and this whole thing, and not comparing you and your father. I'm just saying there's a glass half full and a glass half empty type of scenario.
Absolutely.
Where your father. So here's the funny part that I think, because you did mention in our first conversation that you kind of want to talk about generational things. Yeah. And I think if there's one topic that doesn't get brought up enough, it's that I don't think I've ever seen a generation that's been force-fed the idea to communicate more, but given no skill sets to communicate properly. And by the way, communicate properly doesn't mean everyone just says what you want to hear, right?
Sure.
But the big thing is we become really passive-aggressive, right, as time goes on. And again, 25, just go look at TV shows that are 20 years or older. It's a different planet that we're talking about here, right? But there's very little directness anymore. And so there's this whole idea of I need you to read my mind what I need today. And, and that kind of a thing. And it's kind of long as drawn out because, again, not that you could as a kid, but you could sit down with your father and just say, hey, what is it? You say you want me to be a pilot. Maybe I do, maybe I don't. What is it you really want? Now, you can't really do it as a kid and kind of get down to the brass tacks, but you're an adult now, and it could simply be a conversation. But most people don't want to have those conversations, right? Not
correct
specifically, but in general.
Yeah.
You've got a really interesting scenario today based on I have to feel comfortable and convenient at all times. And it's terrifying when I see it the older I get, because this whole I've got to be in my comfort zone. Of course, we can't improve when we're in our comfort zone. But there's this convenience thing that kind of gets me as well. But look, I've got an old story I used to always tell people about someone having toilet tissue on their shoe. And I used to do it in leadership trainings. And it's, what do you do, right? If you see someone, a stranger, you don't even know them.
Yeah.
What do you do? And you got 20 managers, directors, and VPs in this training. And you'd be amazed at what some of the answers are. But the answer for 90% of them, even though they won't come out and say it, is, I do nothing. I don't really care, right? It's not my shoe. I don't know this guy or gal, so I don't really care.
Right.
And in reality, then you get another 10 or 20% of them that just come out and go, well, I want to say something to them, but I don't want to embarrass them, right? And I'm like, so my answer was, wait a second. So you think letting them walk around with toilet tissue in public, that's going to save them from embarrassment?
Yeah.
When the one and only answer is give or take is simply casually walk up to that person and kind of slowly in their ear say, hey, don't look down right now. but you have toilet tissue stuck to your shoe. I'm going to walk away, and in a couple of minutes or a couple of seconds, feel free to look down, grab it, and throw it out so no one else have to look.
Yeah.
Don't worry, I don't think anyone else has seen it. You're
Yeah.
good to go. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon or whatever.
Right.
But that's the way. You want to know why? Because God forbid you're responsible for maybe making society an easier and better place,
Yeah.
even for people you don't know. But
Yeah.
I think we do this whole thing of, well, I think we keep crossing lines of, I get to keep saying I'm polite because I never have to worry about being nice, right? And I think that's
Yeah.
a dangerous game.
Yeah, it is. It is, absolutely. And so Jordan Peterson, I don't know if you're familiar,
Of course.
he talks about the difference between being nice and being a good person. And this
different.
is huge. It's huge, right?
Yeah.
And being nice means you wouldn't hurt a fly. But that doesn't mean you're a character worth any sort of, you don't really have any moral standards. And being a good person, and he says it, is having a sword but keeping it sheathed. So it's like you're capable of
It's potential.
taking control, right?
Yeah,
Potential.
Yeah.
Yes. And it's really incredible to think about. And I'm glad that you actually brought up that scenario of having the piece of toilet paper, stuck to your shoe, and it's about, public service in a sense, and the whole, well, I'm not going to talk to them or remove the piece of toilet paper from their shoe because it's not my problem, or you don't want to embarrass them further. But the thing is they keep walking around with that piece of toilet paper on their shoe. It's going to continually embarrass them. So, but what if you could go up to that person without judgment, because you're not judging them, shit happens, or excuse me, things happen, right? So it's like, hey, you got this piece of toilet paper on your shoe. I'm just going to step on it real quick and just want you to walk away. Just take a couple steps in the future, and we're going to solve this problem together. I don't care. I mean, it happens, right? And I think I did that to somebody, actually. It wasn't a piece of toilet paper, but it was something stuck to their shoe, right? And it's so funny that you brought that up, because this happened a couple weeks ago. And I think the lady was surprised that I so willingly and just without any care in the world helped her with a little bit of embarrassment. And it kind of shows this, I don't know how to say it, but I think it relates in a
It's
sense.
courage, by the way, is where you're
Yeah.
going. It's courage. We
Yes.
don't have
And
a lot of it. We don't have a lot of personal courage anymore. We certainly don't have much for professional courage anymore.
yeah.
Doing what's right because it's right.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
to hell with the consequences on top
Right.
of that. That is certainly places you and people like you in a distinct minority today. And again, you can hide behind as many excuses as you want. Well, I didn't want to embarrass them, and I don't even know them, and I don't believe me. It's an endless list. But after it's all said and done, the old cliche, you got to be able to sleep at night type of thing. I don't know if it's that. You know what I think the big thing comes down to? For me, look, I don't know what the number is exactly, but I've had a couple thousand people underneath me in my career, right? Dotted line and direct reports and that sort of thing. And I don't know. I think I've got like 40 or 50 LinkedIn references. Great, right? Well, guess what?
Yeah.
I'll guarantee I've got at least 40 or 50 people who have little dolls that look just like Don Hammond, and they poke the crap out of that thing. Can't say again, right?
Sure.
And by the way, that means I'm probably doing it right. And what I mean by that is,
Yeah.
I have trouble believing that you can truly be making change and doing good, and the entire room likes and respects you. It's not that. I mean, it can happen, but generally speaking, in order to elicit change and real positivity, you have to have opinions, and you have to have the courage to fight for those opinions if you think that they're right, and that's going to tick some people off, and it could be in direct conflict with what other people think is right and wrong. And by the way, it's okay to disagree, right?
Right.
It really is. It's okay that we don't have to be in lockstep 24/7. But I can say in the bigger picture of things is worry less about winning popularity contests.
Yeah.
And worry more about being respected by your friends, right? Because look, when it comes to your enemies and so forth, it doesn't make a difference what you do anyways. They're not going to like you. They're not going to care for you. Who gives a damn? After
Right.
it's all said and done, when that final day you have on this little blue ball happens, and there's going to be a handful of people or whatever to show up there, those people don't need to hear. That's why I always explain to people: don't make excuses. Your
Yeah.
friends don't need to hear them, and your enemies won't believe you anyways,
Yeah.
right? And so I think there's something to be said about, right because it's right, and
Yeah.
then don't worry about it. Face the consequence. I always tell people, they're like, well, I didn't want to tell my teammate A, B, and C. I didn't want to tell them I'm not their boss. You're right, you're not their boss. But let's say this comes up the line, and I'm the CEO of the company, right? Do you honestly believe I'd be mad at you if it somehow got through HR that Nicholas advised his teammate, we need better effort from you because you're lagging and you're hurting the entire team?
Yeah.
Do you honestly believe I would find that to be a problem? And by the way, that's not happening enough in corporate America today. There are not
Sure.
enough people at my level ensuring people at the middle and lower levels that you can be honest and you can be courageous, because if you're doing the right thing, I'll make sure I'll back you accordingly. And
Yeah.
it just doesn't happen enough. So people get scared. And so I understand. That's why they don't go help the toilet tissue guy, right? Or guy.
Yeah.
And they just keep to themselves because it's safe. But eventually that safety usually comes back to haunt you, right?
Yeah. So it seems like, and based on that there's not enough leaders. So this brings us to the topic of conversation of what is a leader, and what are some of the, let's say, if you could name the top 3 traits of a good leader, and a leader that would fit in any business model or any scenario, what would you say that those top 3 traits are?
And that's a good question. I think it depends on what you're leading, who you're leading, sort of a thing.
Yeah.
I think leadership. Again, now we start getting fine lines. What's management versus leadership? So I actually teach there are 4 steps of management, right? There are
Okay.
4 things you can do. You'll be a great manager. Does that necessarily make you a great leader? Probably, but I think there's a little bit more nuance to becoming a great leader. But to be a great manager, hire good people. By the way, good people are kind of like in quotes there, right? Are they
Yeah.
intelligent, hardworking? Can they take direction? Smart, that sort of thing. 2, set proper expectations for those good people. In other words, it's not just about this is your salary or your commission or your benefits plan. It's like, this is how we like to communicate, right? This is how we like to do things. Or if you have questions, come to me. This is the way we dress at work. Hey, we don't bring our pet horse into the office. Whatever it is that you need to break out, you set those expectations for. And it's in a simple form that just means communicate, right? And it's continuous. It never ends. The third piece is, so hire good people, set the proper expectations, ensure that people have the tools, resources, and training to meet and exceed those expectations. You set all these expectations for people. This is how we expect you to be productive. This is how we expect you to be efficient. This is how we expect you to this and this. Okay, are you supplying what they need to do it, right? Don't ask for the moon and stars unless you're willing to give the moon and stars. And I think a lot of companies can kind of fall short on that whole thing, even from a culture perspective. And then last but not least, and I used to fail at this miserably in my 30s and finally got good at it by the time I was around 40. That is, so hire good people, set the proper expectations, ensure they have the tools, resources, and training to meet and exceed those expectations. And when they do exceed those expectations, celebrate with them in ways that make them want to do it more often on a grander scale, right?
Yeah.
And by the way, and if they don't meet, we have to have conversations, right? Sometimes difficult conversations. And then there's kind of a funny part in that. When they meet the expectations, give a tip of the hat, but don't roll out the red carpet because someone did their job.
Sure.
That is what I call social welfare. It is a train wreck. Every single time someone shows up and does their job, we have to start trumpets playing and everything else. It's a little silly. But if people are doing extraordinary work, they should be treated extraordinarily, right?
Yeah.
And I think if you can do those 4 things, you create a great manager, right? Those are 4 really difficult things to do. But I mean, as for like what's a leader or traits of leadership, I mean, again, I think we're some of that. Again, you got to lead by example, and you have to be able to inspire people, and you have to be able to keep their focus, and even when they're kind of losing their heads around them. I think those are longer, deeper conversations. But I think, believe it or not, if you can show people that you have a legitimate business acumen, you can do those 4 things we just talked about for management, and you can make quality, educated decisions, you are in the top 5% of leaders inside any organization for that.
Yeah.
So hopefully that was...
Yeah, absolutely. And I had somebody recently explain to me, something about leadership and the ability, because there's the dictator kind of leadership where somebody is really good at seeing what people need to do and putting them on that task, right? So that's maybe a leader in the sense of being able to offload tasks and see the bigger picture of where the whole ship needs to go. And right, very tactical, right? But then there's a way of going about it. And so this, we may get to where, now we're dealing with sensitivities. Now we're walking around people's sensitivities and their inability to take direction. But what if somebody was in the background as a leader and had a conversation with somebody about their, maybe this person is very creative. Maybe they're a very creative individual and they're in a creative role. And what if you were able to have a conversation with them and in the background, you really have your hand on the tiller and you're doing XYZ thing, but honestly, you're pointing the direction of the ship in a way, you're pointing them in a direction that will both honor their creativity and enhance their creativity, as well as sending them in the direction that they need to go, right? Because when you're dealing with a creative person and you come off strong or this or that, or it's like, hey, I need you to focus on XYZ thing, like just point your creativity in there, into that direction because that's what I need done. But what if you went about it in a way where, let's say, I think the question that I'm getting at is how would you go about guiding somebody that isn't necessarily telling them what to do? And do you even agree with that in the first place?
Those are two really good questions. Well, let's do the second part first. And do I agree with it? Mostly no.
Okay.
I guess here's why I say this. I'm one of the few people who's actually worked in all three silos of an organization. I've been in the finance silo, I've been in the revenue generation silo, and I've been in the operational silo.
Okay.
Hence, I've got a pretty good idea of every role in a company and cross-functionality, that sort of thing. The number of positions in an organization that truly require creativity is about 0.000000001%. Now, creativity could mean finding better ways to do things. It could mean creating efficiency. Now that, I'm with you, right? It kind of goes things along. But I think here's what people need to understand today. And they used to understand it pretty well before, but I think the lines get blurred a little bit more. And that is, I guess the easiest way to put it is you've got to eat your vegetables and your meat before you get your dessert. If you're looking to use all your creativity, then do your damn job right to begin with.
Right.
Your first job. Yeah. Nobody should be helping you along with building your career if you can't even do the minimums of the requirements of the position you've taken and agreed to. So my whole thing is, should I be fostering your creativity? Man, you've worked here for 4 months, I need you to just get this job done.
Yeah.
A year or two from now, maybe let's have that conversation. But everyone kind of wants this more instant gratification, that sort of thing. But you need to prove yourself to a certain degree, right?
Yeah.
Prove to me that you're actually willing to dedicate yourself to your team. You dedicate yourself to the company. Dedicate yourself to just people being around you and yourself getting better versus this whole thing of, well, this isn't fitting me very well. And by the way, I just did this recently with a senior management group. We were doing a training and so forth, and one of the things I mentioned was we talked about message packaging, and that's a very popular topic in the last 5 or 10 years. And it's I always kind of find it amazing that the people who are most concerned about packaging are the ones who have the least amount of understanding about the actual content. What I mean by that is, look, if someone gives you a birthday card and inside of it's $1,000 in a very heartfelt one-page letter, but when you get it, the envelope is all beat up and the dog chewed on it and you're all pissed off now because it's not pristine, whatever. You're not getting the bigger picture of things. You were so hung up on the envelope, the packaging behind it. What I don't have I'm not getting a gift as well. You're only giving me a card. You see what I'm saying? Where you self-manufacture all of these pitfalls for yourself where people are somehow shortchanging you. They're somehow not meeting your expectations. And by the way, these are just expectations you made up in your head. And you kind of go through all this stuff, and they're so caught up on the packaging, which, by the way, reeks of insincerity in different levels that we won't even bother to get into. But that's a problem. Right, and not just because of the problem I just gave you, but it's one of those things where we, again, self-manufactured sensitivities, and I'm not trying to look. You talked about there's a big difference between being nice and being good. If my friend is 100 pounds overweight and they really, really, really like chocolate, and I know, matter of fact, they love chocolate, and I know they do.
Yeah.
I've got two choices, right? I can either take something away from them that they love, or I can shake my head up and down and I can watch them go through the horrific mental and health issues that are going to arise from being 100 pounds, 150 pounds, 200 pounds overweight, that kind of thing. You're right. Everyone has freedom of choice. Everybody can do whatever they want. I'm okay with all of that stuff. Yeah. But we don't have to sit idly by and agree with it. Now, again, do what you want. You can call yourself Nicholas today. You can call yourself King Nicholas tomorrow. I'm okay with that. I'll just call you Nicholas. We'll just kind of move from there. But if you want to officially change your name, whatever, again, we all have our own personal decisions. I'm good with all that stuff. You get to take accountability for all those things you want. But at some point in time, if you want people to jump through hoops for you to respect you, you're going to actually have to show a certain level of sincerity for them.
Yeah.
And that would be my basis of going back to there's certain levels of creativity. Look, don't get me wrong. I've had employees over the years and team members over the years who I'm like, you see them get plugged into just the wrong department, right? You're like, oh, man, we're never going to last in this whole thing. Let's get them into something that fits them better. But you need to have the conversation with them that, hey, I think there's a better fit for you somewhere else. But I want to let you know, this is the one and only time we're doing this. You took this other job that you probably knew you weren't a good fit for. And I'm okay for us to make that adjustment right now. But in 6 months, you can't come to me and say, no, this one isn't good for you either, right? Because then what we're doing, we're just spoiling the child, right? I don't mean the adult's a child, but that's what we're doing, right? Where we just keep giving them more and more options until they just use up that option. They want a new one. And so I think that's where the thing comes into where can we do a better job of being thoughtful towards people and listening to people and making work a better place to be? Absolutely. Absolutely. We got to get a lot better at that. Lots of sociopaths at the tops of companies. Nobody should be debating that. That being said, we have a lot of sociopaths at the bottom of companies too. And so, what I'd like to see? I'd like to see that silent majority step into the mix and go, it'd be great. Let's fire the senior vice president who screams at puppies on Tuesdays, as well as the guy who's worked here for 3 years and has literally accomplished nothing. And we just pay him or her every single week, every 2 weeks. That's what I'd like to see come in. I don't want us to try and find new ways to sculpt realities that fit very, very small, minute minority viewpoints and personalities. I'd like us to find ways to where everybody can contribute and be successful because they're being motivated the right way.
Right. Yeah. And so now we're talking about, we are getting into sensitivities, right? The ability to guide somebody and the ability to not, right?
I'm terrified on this podcast right now.
No, but it's coming down to self-confidence.
Oh yeah.
And that seems to be the biggest issue, whether it's, stepping on a piece of toilet paper that somebody's walking or dragging on, or telling so-and-so to, knock off the chocolate because you're gaining too much weight. It's about our own confidence and our ability to be authentic in ourselves, our job. We know what we're good at. We know what we're not so good at. We understand our limitations, and we're able to move forward and move through life in a conscious way. And I think that's probably the biggest problem is self-confidence. What do you think about that?
No. Look, I think it's huge. I think the self-confidence thing, and I think you were going right in that direction. I think one other big piece to piggyback on what you just said. People who, let's use a less positive word.
Okay.
People who are insecure. Because that's really what we're talking about, right?
Yes. Yeah.
One of the killers for the insecurity thing is that's the same personality that can't admit wrong.
Yeah.
Right? You ever notice that? They can't admit they're wrong. They can't admit fault. They can't admit failure.
Yeah.
And so therefore, every time they drop the ball, everyone's got to walk on eggshells around them, that sort of thing.
Yep.
Like nobody can point out what they've done is incorrect.
Yeah.
People just correct it for them and then move around
Right.
them and that sort of thing. But so there's something to be said about that. Again, and to kind of go into the Gen Z side of the house, I think have things changed that much? I don't know, maybe some things have, maybe some things haven't. I mean, but I do think one thing in particular has changed over the last couple generations, and it's what I'll just call kind of maybe comeuppance,
Hmm.
where you earned a particular negative outcome. Now you lay in it
Right.
and
Yeah.
and take it in and learn something from it
Yeah.
and stop
Hmm.
blaming other people for it. And
Yeah.
instead, what we do is we go, "Oh my God, don't do that to them. Look at they're so upset and they're crying or they're upset." Like,
Mm.
yeah, I know they are.
Sure.
There's a reason they are. By the way, they've also figured out that every single time they screw something up, if the waterworks come out or they act really upset, they get off the hook, right? So
Right.
this is a programmed response and so forth that comes into it to a certain degree. But I think there's something to be said where, look, if there's anything I'm probably decent at, I think over the years, it's having, look, I'm not a big fan of one-on-ones. I'm not.
Mm.
I am a big fan of communication. And
Mm.
I think there's a big difference. If you've got something you want to talk to me about, we don't have to wait till next Wednesday at 2 p.m. during our
Hmm.
scheduling.
Yeah.
But and vice versa, by the way. I'm not waiting to talk to you until next week if something's going on. So I have a tendency to grab people and pull in my office or whatever the case may be and say, hey, I was either just in the last meeting and I saw something, or hey, someone said something. Hey, is everything good with you? What's going on? You're someone that I enjoy you in the workplace. I think you're good at what you do. I think you're good with the people around you. Things seem off. I'm a big tire kicker. Is everything okay
Mm.
with this? What's going on?
Yeah.
And kind of check-ins, that sort of a thing. Don't get me wrong. I don't. I don't ask you, hey, were you abused as a child or anything like that. It's much
Right.
more of, you know, I think a lot of people just want to know that someone else gives a damn,
Yeah.
right? And
Absolutely.
and
Yeah.
in a lot of jobs today, look, I'm old enough now. I'm getting ready to see this thing go full circle. Where,
Hmm.
earlier in my career, it was the companies never cared, and the people got spit out the door and that sort of a thing. And
Yeah.
now companies seem incredibly stunned that a lot of the people don't seem to care. And I'm like,
Mm.
at 30 years of not really giving a crap about your team and employees, will have a tendency to kind of have some water, some drainage
Yeah.
that comes down off that whole thing. I don't get me wrong. There's a part of me that might be slightly jealous. There are 20 somethings today who give less, what, than seasoned executives have learned to
Yeah.
not give a crap about one on one.
Wow.
Is part of that a good thing? Yeah. But there's that fine line, right? Of, okay, don't be a part of the system. That's fine. Okay, the system's broken. But you're going to need some sort of structure around yourself and the people around you and something that's systematic so that you can also pace yourself. So you can also set goals for yourself. So you can also
Yeah.
engage yourself with other people and, and because if you don't have some sort of structure, it's almost impossible to be productive. And before someone listens to this goes, no, the whole world's all about production. I'm talking about generalized production. Hey,
Hmm.
my life is getting better. Hey, the people around me enjoy my company. Hey, I'm respected by people around me. Hey,
Mm.
people who meet me, like me because for who I am as a person, not just because I nod my head, kind of thing. But and so look, life should be a lot about self-improvement. And
Yeah.
if that sounds like a really foreign or aggressive term to you, that's unfortunate because
Yeah.
no offense, you're just wrong.
Yeah.
Um, every day we should be looking out, going, "What more can I do?" And you mentioned Jordan
Yeah.
Peterson, and it's funny because I had this with my grandfather. Be the person that people come to during a funeral, right?
Yeah.
And it turned out I was only in my 20s, my early 20s at that time, and I was kind of that guy. Family
Yeah.
members who more than double my age were coming to me, and I gave a speech and did this whole thing. And there's something about that where it has nothing to do with age. It has nothing to do necessarily with tenure. It has everything to do with how you hold yourself. Can
Yeah.
you be depended on to make
Mm.
good decisions?
Yeah.
Can you be dependent on to be objective? and
Yeah.
competent. And, believe me, you can point that out in a 13-year-old or a 33-year-old or a
Hmm.
103-year-old. It's not
Yeah.
something you just necessarily grow into.
Yeah. That's an interesting. It's so a lot of people I believe would put the trait of emotionless onto that, but I think that might be wrong. It's the ability to take emotions into consideration and then look at the facts and come up with the end result, right? So you have the kind of person who, you might think would be reliable is because emotions never get to them and they're always just this solid character. And I don't know if that's necessarily beneficial in all areas of life. But then you have somebody who's way in too emotional, where yes, they're very sensitive emotionally and they're very in tune with emotions and they can spot emotions in another person very quickly and very accurately. But when you look at one spectrum or the other, or one side of the spectrum or the other, you end up with one side can't really touch into this side, and then this side can't really touch into this side. So then you look at the middle road with that, and I believe it's important. So you're saying, the funeral, if somebody were to come to you in the funeral, so how do you become the person that is rock solid and people come to at the funeral, right, for support? And you can't disregard emotions to be that person, because there has to be some emotional feel in that scenario, because it's a big scenario. A lot of people sometimes don't really know how to take death or how to take this or tragedy or loss or any of that. So you can't be unemotional, but you can't also let emotions rule. And
It's
so it's
controlled emotion, right?
yes, yeah.
And there's, well, look, emotions and vitamins are like the same thing in my world, right? If you don't take in enough vitamins, you can die of malnutrition. If you take in too many vitamins, it's toxic and you can die, right?
Yeah.
So the extremes on either side
Right.
are bad. And if you're highly emotional and your answer to everything is, well, I'm just really emotional all the time.
Right.
I'm sure you are. We know it. And then
Yeah.
that whole idea of, well, I'm just dead inside. Look, that is not the answer,
Right.
right? The
Yeah.
difference is that,
Yeah.
look, if there's people out there listening to this, and I don't mind telling you, look, always being the adult in the room, always being the person that people can depend on. One, it can get very tiring at times.
Yeah.
Two, it can get super lonely at times.
Yeah.
Um,
Mm.
and so, but you make sure that you can back that up with a certain support system and people and so forth. Partner, spouse, whatever the case may be, hobbies or other thing is it. And two, there's also something about always getting your second wind, because you're like, I'm tired because I'm doing the right thing, you
Mm.
know?
Yeah.
And that takes a lot of energy. But you know what? If I've got, of all the tireds I can choose from right now, this one isn't so bad.
That's a
My
good
other
one.
tired could be that I've run away from all my problems and so I'm
Mm.
exhausted, right?
Yeah.
That's not a great
No.
tired to be. And so I think that's what, look, there's not a magic wand, and that is during our brief conversation before last week, I think we touched on this a little bit. It's not that things have necessarily changed all that entirely. There's always been bad advice going around, right? There's always been someone telling high school boys stupid crap to do, right? That kind of thing.
Yeah.
Stuff going on. But obviously, the internet makes it easier to access for sure. You can see a lot more options and opportunities to do stupid. And that's boys and
Yeah.
girls, men and women, right? But I think there's something to be said about, just because someone's saying something doesn't mean you have to listen. Just
Yeah.
because someone's got some crazy opinions doesn't mean you actually have to do it. Just because my grandmother always had a saying. My grandparents were immigrants, that kind of thing, whatever. And it's like, my grandmother always made the comment, just because we were poor didn't mean we had to be dirty. There's something, right. There's something to be said about that whole thing. Where
Yeah.
people, well, if you're poor, you must be dirty. That's a crazy ideology to have. Matter of fact, it's an ideology that's going to probably guarantee you remain poor, by the way. So there's something to be said out there where, just because life handed you a bunch of lemons, lemonade, margaritas, whatever it is you plan on making, although that's technically lime, sorry. But I mean, after it's all said and done, you need to, again, it goes back to, you've got to find a way to be productive. And that's, again, I didn't realize this is going to be an all, Jordan Peterson 101, but he gave an advice to people that I've been giving advice, and I think I got it from someone back when I was nice. Look, if you're having a bad day, go clean your damn room. Shut up.
Yeah.
Go figure stuff out.
Yeah.
I used to have it, again, I didn't get married till I was 40 years old. I used to have it run around, that sort of thing. Work 60, 70 hours a week and that kind of thing. Things are going. And I used to change the furniture around, man, like once every 2 months. And I come home and I almost forget about it. I'm like, oh, shit, it's like a new place, right? I'm doing it.
Right. Yeah.
But, there's something to be said. Go, go to different restaurants, go to different bars. If you're not used to going up and meeting people, damn it, go up and meet some people that you don't know. Do things you're not used to doing. Change the furniture around in your room, whatever it is. But you got to elicit change in some way, shape, or form.
That's
and a
huge.
lot of times, if you do, kind of gets the hamster wheel moving for you, right?
Yeah,
You start getting some inertia and that sort of thing. But the big part is start having some belief in yourself. Stop being scared. Stop being weak. Because, by the way, scared and weak are choices you're making.
Yeah. And that can be
whatever you want to call it, but find your way, a new, better way.
Yeah, and we did last week talk about the difference between men and women a little bit, and we are equal but different. So I think for young men, and speaking as one, and the whole confidence and self-esteem and change and feeling like you have the strength to change comes from accomplishment and starting your day with accomplishment. So along the lines of, go clean your room. Well, that's one thing that you accomplished. And it's a little thing, but weirdly, it makes you feel really good after you clean your room. And
remember,
that's
we talked
step
about
one.
Construction, right? At the beginning of this call.
Yeah.
There's something to be said. At the beginning of the day, there's a pile of lumber over here and some boxes of nails and screws.
Right.
And then by the second day, by the third day, look, you're going to think it sounds funny, but to this day, my wife and I leave the house about the same time. The bed is made every single day by me. I still do it.
Yeah.
And just for you guys out there, look, in my 20s and 30s, and I was doing my fast track to, taking over the world and all that kind of stuff. I had the handwritten messages on the mirror. Be better today. Do what you need to, there's that kind of thing. Motivate yourself whatever way it is that you need to do. And by the way, constantly audit what you're doing to see if it works. If you're like, hey, man, I've been doing the same thing for a year, nothing's changed. Yeah, you waited too long, right?
Yeah.
If you're not, it's not instant gratification, but if you're at 30 days and you're not saying, tweak a few things, right? If you're at 60 or 90 days, right? But the big thing is, and I can't stress this one enough, put together a plan, damn it, and not that I want to be rich. Look, do the old school SMART goals, right? Specific, measurable, attainable, rewarding, timely.
Yeah.
You can't check all 5 of those boxes and it's not a real goal. And a lot of times we have to take big goals that don't check all 5 of those boxes and create smaller goals that fit in and do those things. But that's where a lot of this stuff comes down to. But I mean, look, I've mentored a lot of people over the years. I mean, dozens and dozens, men and women. And one of the first things you quickly find out for the people is, well, I can literally tell you, I ask people 2 questions at the very beginning, and that's whether I even agree to do it or not. One, how do you schedule your day? And if you don't have a real good answer, I'm probably not going to work with you.
Yeah.
And 2, right? Like, I can't fix. You're broken, my friend. I can't. You can't even do the minimal thing. Like, I just wing it, right? That kind of thing. And the other thing I always ask is, why are you even bothered to do this? Why are you even bothering to ask me? If you don't have a really good reason, like, hey, I want to be vice president before I'm 32, or hey, I want to start my own business, or hey, I want to feel good about myself because I produce and I'm an earner, or hey, I'm dating this man or woman and we want to get married soon and I want to make sure we can buy a house, or whatever that whole thing is. I don't care, but it better be a good one. If the basis is like, hey, why are we talking? And someone's like, my friend's older brother knows you, and it's like, no, I don't care. I mean, and it's not. And so those things sound terrible.
Yeah.
But, I mean, I've been teaching this stuff.
True.
I do leadership trainings in every organization I come into. So it doesn't make a difference what department you're in. And believe it or not, we do time management. We do scheduling. We do what makes a leader. We do that kind of a thing. And for the people who are too cool for school and the people who find that tedious, fine. You're just not a part of it. You probably won't last either. But I mean, after it's all said and done, we're going to have to change. And that's
Yeah.
one of the things I always laugh and joke about, because you always hear people, I don't really care for change. I literally did this to a guy five
Mm.
year end, and I worked in a place where bonuses and plans and so forth at the end of the year
Hmm.
were public knowledge, right? So
Hmm.
there was no guesswork on
Right.
what anyone was getting. There were literally reports for it and that kind of thing. And this was a guy who was always, pardon my French, he just never stopped bitching, right? And
Yeah.
and he worked for a guy that worked for me, and of course he was twice my age, so that always made it more interesting. But it
Hmm.
was one of those deals where everyone was getting out their big year-end bonus checks and all that kind of stuff, and then in front of everyone, because I thought this was a great idea, 32 years old or whatever, and where I was like, hey, and last but not least is Nicholas, and his bonus this year was XYZ, but I decided not to put it in for him, so it's not going to get paid out because I know how much he hates change, right? And then
Wow.
so, but of course I
Yeah.
did it, but think
Sure.
about how silly that is. Like, oh, I hate change. Okay, well, great, I won't pay you more then, because that's change. And
Yeah.
I don't want you to.
Yeah.
Change is agnostic.
Yeah.
It's what you make of it, right?
Yeah.
The worst events in your life might set off bells and whistles in your head to turn you into the best person possible.
Yeah.
And great instances and events in your life, if you don't take advantage of them, if you take them for granted, and you're shallow about the accomplishments over themselves, can people being successful too quick and too early, type of
Yeah.
thing. It can start a spiral that sends you into a terrible place. So it's
Yeah.
all entirely up to you, right? I mean, you get to make the path, and whether it's the most respectable path or not, sure, certainly. But a lot of it also just comes down to, you gotta take care of yourself, in the sense of
Yeah.
doing the right thing and embracing change, because it's the only way you can get better.
Yeah, it is. Absolutely. And I think this change has a lot to do with death. And it's, on a spiritual level as well as it is on a physical level. And I think our idea of death, and you let me know what you think of this, is skewed. And death should be something that happens every day. And it's
Well,
the
it is.
ability. I'm glad you agree. I'm glad you agree. It's the
It does
ability
happen
to
every day. Whether you choose to acknowledge
analyze.
it is a whole different. Yeah.
Sure, and maybe not outside of yourself, but within yourself. A piece of yourself every day should be dying off and being replaced by something new. And that is the change I think that I live my life by. And it's that adding and subtracting. If I'm not subtracting something from my life that isn't doing me good anymore, then I'm not adding anything back in that's going to replace that.
You're getting to a really interesting topic there, right? And that's kind of getting rid of it, albatrosses, anchors, whatever it is,
Yeah.
call them, type of thing. But people have, again, that's comfort zone stuff, right?
Yeah.
People eat for a reason, right? That's comforting. Type
Yeah.
of thing. People keep certain people in their life. Like my wife's literally a mental health professional, and we go back and forth all the time about drug addiction. I'm like, well,
Yeah.
ours will always fail the place. Again, the 12 steps or 10 steps or whatever the thing is, that's the most successful one
Yeah.
out there, and it has like an 8% success rate.
Yeah,
And the
right.
reason why is because you take people and you go put them in these rehabs and like, and then you go put them right back in the same environment they were in that caused the drug addiction to begin with.
Yeah.
So that's I think it's kind of a moot point, but I think there's also a literal part about that. When you say death, look, it wasn't that long ago. What is it? I believe Bill Clinton, again, your age group will be like, ugh, but I believe Bill Clinton was the first U.S. president born in a hospital. Elected in 1992.
Wow.
So
Wow.
it wasn't that long ago. And again, it wasn't that long ago where 2 and 3 generations lived in a single home in this country, right? Grandparents,
Yeah.
that sort of thing, And so throw in crazy stuff like polio, things like this, young children die, whatever. But, if you were born and raised in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, there's a high likelihood you lived in a home that one of your family members passed away in.
Right.
That's just a fact,
Yeah.
right? People didn't go to hospitals back then, that sort of thing. The baby boomers are really the first generation that wasn't the case, right? So they were all born in hospitals, And now what do we see, though? This is also the same generation. Go look at insurance expenses right now, right? What do they say the last 6 months of life are? It's like 80+% of all insurance that's spent. So go ask yourself, how did we get to that point? People are just terrified of death.
Yeah.
I mean, You know,
Hmm.
I've seen it with family members where I'm stunned at the decisions that my family members have made over time where I'm like, why are you putting him or her through this? What, just so you can have a couple extra months? Because
Right.
that is terrible what's going on over
Right.
there. And not, I don't mean to sound like a Grim Reaper, please hear me out.
No.
I'm just saying, you know, you're not doing that because of their best interest. You're doing that because you're not ready to make the right decisions
Yeah.
and take on some realities maybe that make
Yeah.
you feel uncomfortable. Or God forbid you may think someone may view you the wrong way and you make
Yeah.
that decision. But I think that, you know, so there's a figurative and a literal thing where, you know, how do we handle death and death in this case, let's say, is just the base of something going away, right?
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
and not existing in your life anymore. And we're really, really not good at that.
No, we're terrible at it.
We
Yeah.
are horrific at,
Yeah.
at that whole thing. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't want to think of it that way, but yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. It's bad. And I I remember, and let's not talk about metaphorical death as far as, killing parts of yourself off and,
Right,
and
right, right,
allowing
right.
new parts to grow, but maybe the physical part of it and the actual reality of people literally passing away. So I remember the first, and it wasn't the first, but it was the last death that I dealt with as a kid that really got me. And it got me good. And I was just a kid, and I was taking guitar lessons. And I don't know what it was about this guitar teacher, but we really bonded. And he shared with me, I think part of it was because he was sharing with me his passion. And I remember when he passed away, it was weeks after that, and I'd cry every time I'd walk in the guitar store, in the shop, or I'd think about him, or I'd even pick up the guitar again, or pick up his old notes, or something like that, and I would cry and cry and cry and think about the loss of him. And that, to me, when I look back at my life, that was the last death that ever really got me. And now I feel like when people pass away, it has a completely different effect on me than it does other
In,
people.
in what way?
I would say that I don't think of it as loss. And I can get into all sorts of woo-woo stuff and my spiritual ideologies and how I deal with death. And a lot of people, they go to extreme routes like taking ayahuasca or going on these journeys to deal with death. And that's what it is. When people go to and have an ayahuasca ceremony, it's because they need to look at death and they need to have a better understanding on what death actually
That's
is.
interesting. I usually think people do it to look at life.
Well, you're looking at the same thing. I think when you look at death, you are looking at life. And
Okay.
when you are able to eliminate your fear of death, you get to look at life. And we can't truly look at life without eliminating the fear of death and realizing that death isn't, and here's my belief on death, right? Where it's not the end of life itself, but the beginning of a new one. And maybe that's just my hope or this or that.
Well,
Go
no,
ahead. You have
part
a,
of that is spiritual, and again, everybody's got their belief systems. But what you're hitting on to a certain degree is what's absolutely proven: exposure therapy, right? And it's like I
yeah,
said, if you were raised in the all the way up through the 1950s, there's a high likelihood, a family member died in your home, literally like on your couch or in a bed, and you were there for it. You remember it clearly, that sort of thing. And I think that exposure therapy. Look, if you're scared of butterflies, go get in a room full of butterflies, right?
right,
If
right.
you're scared of
Yeah.
heights, go deal with heights. No one ever says that about death, right?
Yeah.
And because what am I going to do? Start hanging out at funerals, right? But more importantly, to your point, I think it has to do with people exposing themselves to either unplanned or unhappy endings
Sure.
and ceasings, and then
Sure.
feeling. Because if you go back earlier in our conversation, one of the things that was mentioned before was the whole idea of kind of comeuppance. Now that's
Yeah.
more of a negative spin on the whole thing, but it's one of those things of where you're kind of forced to be accountable for the outcome, even if you're not a
Yeah.
part. Just sort of the fact that you're just a player involved. Maybe not the main player, or even or the
Yeah.
beta player, but I
Yeah.
think there's something to be said there. Where the death conversation or just a change over in your life. like you have a very mature mindset. I think as we talk about that briefly on our other conversation. I think one of the reasons maybe the one death rattled you at an early age is because probably up to that point in time you had never had any reason to prepare for a death, nor had you. So you didn't know it was coming, and it's
Right.
like, well, but from that point on, that reckoning already now it took place. So now there's not a scenario like I'm always stunned when someone's like, "Oh my God, my grandmother died." I'm like, "Oh really? Oh, that's terrible." Whatever. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Right.
She had cancer for 7 years and she was 96 years old. I'm like, "Geez, Louis, not that you can't feel bad about it, but I'm like,
Right.
wow,
It,
you've had
it's
time, you know,
yeah. Yeah.
you're acting like she got hit
Mm,
by a plane yesterday or something. Like we just
sure.
came out of the blue, you know.
Yeah.
And so I think so. You have a very mature mindset where when you learn something, it seems as if you have a tendency to remember it. And not only do
Mm,
you remember it, you try and learn from it and build on it. Which, if there's
mm,
anyone who's listening to this podcast, write that down, do what you can.
yeah.
Because, by the way, that's literally how you make better decisions in life. And versus most people today, that's a pretty foreign ideology,
Yeah.
right?
That's
I
change. Yeah.
Well, I've just seen people do the same things over and over
Yeah.
again, right? And they stumble
Yeah.
in, and they're like 6 DUI, and you're like, how are you surprised? You already had five. Like,
Right.
where did you think? You know, like there's a process going on here. I don't know
Right.
why you're stunned on the
There,
outcomes, right? At this
yeah.
point in time,
Yeah.
so I think there's something to be said about. I, it goes back to that emotional part that we talked about before, where if you've been mollycoddled long enough, people allow you to use your emotions to manipulate outcomes. And then eventually you get to a point in your adult life where nobody gives a shit about, pardon my French, about your emotions. Or even if they do, it's not going to change the outcome. And
Yeah.
now after 18, 28, 48, 78 years, you're absolutely stunned that your ability to emotionally manipulate an outcome is non-consequential, right? And
Yeah.
so again, I always joke around with my wife, not joke, but, we never see someone in a courtroom, right? And all of a sudden they hear, they murdered someone, and they're like, "You're getting sentenced to life in prison," and then they start bawling. And then, of course, my wife and people like that always go, "Oh my God, they feel bad for the crime." I go, "They don't feel bad about the crime." She's like, "Well, they're crying." I go, "They're crying because they're going to jail for the rest of their life." I said, "You want to know how I know they didn't feel bad about the crime?" And she goes, "Why?" I go, "They didn't turn themselves in." That's
Yeah.
the.
That's right.
Yeah, if you really
That's
felt
right.
bad about what you did, you would have turned yourself in. They went on like
Yeah.
a 2 year manhunt and found your ass. Like,
Yeah.
so we
Right.
know what you're
Yeah.
crying about right now is that you got caught and you're being held accountable.
Yep.
That's a
Yep.
very, very different scenario
Yeah.
versus, so I think we see a lot of that, right?
Yeah.
Where people they're crying because there there are consequences.
Yeah.
Right? And
Yeah.
again, guys, gals on this podcast, look, I'm over 50 now, and yesterday I was 27, so just know, that's how fast this stuff goes.
Yeah.
And um, is there anything I'd take back? Sure, there's a million other things I wish I probably would have done more of than what I already did. And so after it's all said and done, you don't have until tomorrow to grow up. I'm just going to let you
Yeah.
know that. And you don't have until tomorrow to quote get your act together. And
Yeah.
one of the best things you could possibly do is go get an agreement with your parents to cut the strings if they haven't already done it
Yeah.
already. And that if
Yeah.
you're gonna fail on your own because that
Absolutely.
added pressure is going to drive a lot more focus out of you, is going to drive a lot more effort and energy out of you. And believe it or not, you're going to get the best out of yourself when you know
Yeah.
there isn't an umbilical cord waiting in the background or a
It's
safety
huge.
net with mommy and daddy's checkbook.
That's
And,
huge.
you know,
That's absolutely huge. And I actually have a very powerful story related to that. And and it's along the lines of following in dad's footsteps and all of this. And I was living in the house. I was, flight instructing and all of that. And I look back now at the decision to leave flying completely and pursue a dream as in the moment, I thought that it was me going against my father. Well, I'm going to walk my own path. I'm going to do my own thing. It was this kind of resistance thing. But now I look back and I realize what I was really doing. It's funny because sometimes I can look back at myself and go, I was smarter than I originally remembered. I left. I had 2 job offers that would have been great. It was in 2021. And it was in the largest hiring boom in aviation history ever. And it will remain that way likely forever. And 2021 was huge for the aviation industry. People were handing out job offers to flight instructors left and right. People were getting jobs that they should not have been able to get. And I was among those flight instructors that was getting those jobs. And I had 2 of them, 2 job offers. I could go wherever I wanted to, whichever airline that I wanted to go to. And I said, I'm going to not do this. And the conscious thought behind that was, I'm not going to, follow in my father's footsteps, blah, blah, blah. I don't want to be like him, yada, yada, all the young stuff and all of that. But what I did was I set myself up because I knew his reaction when I left aviation. I knew what it was going to be, even if I didn't really know what it was going to be. And horses were my passion. I was, training horses on the side, and I was running a little horse training deal. And I love horses. I love working with animals, and I love, training people and teaching them how to communicate with their animals. And so I said, I'm going to do this for real. I'm going to start my own horse training business. And I did. And my parents flipped their what and kicked me off all the this and that, get out of the house, get out of the do this. And I'm like, okay, here we go. Let's do it. And so I lived out of my truck for a couple weeks and, hopping around from various places, trying to scrape together enough clients to pay my bills. And I ended up doing that. And then I ended up getting to a place where I was able to rent a facility. I found 1,500 acres by happenstance in South Florida that I was able to rent and run my horse training business out of. And that was by far the biggest pivot in my life to this point. And it was because I said, I'm going to go against what everybody else is telling me. I'm going to get out of this environment of comfort, and I'm going to go prove to myself that I can go do this thing on my own. And I was able to do that. And it was the biggest learning curve. It was the hardest time of my life. It was the hardest thing that I ever put myself through. I'd never been taught how to deal with money. I'd never been taught anything about taxes. I'd never been taught anything about running a business. So I got to learn all of that stuff on my own through trial and error. And it was an incredible experience. But the one piece of gold, I think, and I got many pieces of gold out of that, but the big one, the biggest chunk, was proving to myself that I could go and be on my own completely. I could start from scratch. I could be living in my truck, struggling to pay the bills, and I could figure out how to turn this idea into something that monetizes itself and supports me. And that was huge for me. And it wasn't, it was 2 years until I talked to my parents again. And it was an incredible journey. And I ended up hopping all around the country. I left my horse training gig in South Florida and ended up moving out to Scottsdale, Arizona, and riding horses professionally out there. And it was an incredible experience, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. Although there was times that I was very hungry and couldn't figure out how to feed myself that month. But I always ended up coming about a way to overcome that. And that was the biggest part of my life, I would say, that yielded the most return. And it was a huge risk. But you say that about and I'm sorry I go on the story, but you're hitting something. So remember, we were just talking about before, like, look, the death blow to success is comfortability and convenience. Right? Yeah. It's as long as you get to sit in the basement and play video games on the couch, as long as you've got a place to put your head in the house that's got a roof over, as long as there's a full refrigerator of Monster drinks and Doritos, whatever the whole thing is, don't get me wrong, we've done a number on young men in the last 10, 15, 20 years, and that's a different podcast for a different time. But I mean, after it's all said and done, if you're waiting for someone to come into your mom's basement and sweep you off your feet so you can find a better way in life, sorry, brothers, it ain't happening. Yeah.
You're going to have to get your little happy ass up off those steps. You're going to have to go jump in the shower, and you're going to have to go put on a clean pair of clothes, and you're going to have to go up there and make change. And that
Yeah.
is kind of
It's hard.
the manly way of, that's the way it works.
Yeah.
The worst thing you can do as a parent is, you know, tell a kid no matter what happens, I'll always support you.
Exactly.
Bullshit. Yeah, after it's all said and done, as long as
Uh-huh.
you're always working hard, as long as you're trying to make yourself better, I'm more than happy to support you. But
Uh-huh.
if you start becoming a drug addict, you're doing this, no, I'm not going to support
Right.
you. Because the minute, as I know, there's always a safety net behind me. I don't have to worry about bad decisions.
Exactly.
I don't have to worry about consequences, and that's
Yep.
people don't
Yeah.
want to hear that. I'm a helicopter parent. I'm a tiger mom. I'm a whatever stupid acronym thingy that comes up new. After it's all said and done, you can call them as many things as you want, but the answer is you're just a shitty parent. That's
Yeah.
all it is.
Yeah. Being hungry was the best thing that ever happened to me. And legitimately hungry. Like if you're faced with the circumstance of not being able to feed yourself at the end of the day,
Yeah,
it's
It's some
huge.
interesting, yeah. So I had a buddy who used to joke about that he was convinced that there were, microbes in your stomach that when they hadn't been fed long enough, they made your brain smarter because you had to like start coming up with better ideas. And they're there. So I think there's something to be said about that.
Absolutely.
But there, yeah, look,
Absolutely.
I think that's where, again, a lot of this comes down to. And again, even if you're not in that dire straits or whatever, if you're,
Sure.
I can tell you right now, for most guys out there, and again, I won't speak for ladies at this time. I'm a guy, so, but for most guys, I can tell you right now, if you're good and you know who you are, and if your game plan is to being a senior manager or director when you're 50, I can tell you right now, you're going to be miserable as hell. And so you need to come up with a newer, better game plan.
Yeah.
How do I get to director by blah, blah, blah age, VP by blah, blah, blah age? How do I, do I go with different, sorry, I have a dog in the background there. Believe it or not, he's only 6 months. He's just
Listening in. Big,
that?
yeah, big.
He's only 6 months
6
old.
months.
His name is
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
Buddy.
he's Anatolian Shepherd and Pyrenees.
Okay. Oh, nice.
I'm sorry about that. I didn't even know he was in here.
No, he's fine.
But yeah, I mean, I think it's just one of those things where, look, aim higher is my point.
Yeah.
It's not that hard to get what I just talked about before. Aim a lot higher. And if you fail, you fail. You learn from it. But I can tell you right now, if your goal by age 40 is to be a senior manager or an associate director or something, I can tell you right now, good 27-year-olds are that already. Good 29-year-olds are that and beyond already. Put the bar higher, and drive yourself and make it a legitimate goal, right? And one that you're going to actually have to work for.
Yeah, absolutely. And I, this has been such a great conversation, and we're getting. I hope you don't have anything coming up to the end of this, but
I'll got a call in about 10 minutes, but we'd have to.
Okay, let's close this off then. So there's two very important questions that I have for you. The first one piece of advice, given everything that we've talked about and given what you've learned up to this point through your life and your experiences, one piece of advice that you would give to your 18-year-old self. You have just one piece of advice.
I should have read through your questions, so I've been ready for this one. Look, nobody sits on their deathbed and talks about, I took too many risks, and nobody does that. Right? Build yourself up in a way that, and we're talking about work at this time, but it could be personal as well, I guess. Treat people with respect, treat people with professionalism, and so forth and so forth. If you're right about something and you know you're right, I don't mean I feel like I'm right. I mean, you're numerically correct, factually data correct. Stand your ground. It's that courage thing.
Yeah.
It's going to sound funny. I have very few professional regrets. And I've seen some pretty crazy things over the years. But if I had a couple, it's that my gut knew, or the data told me, and the facts are like, this was either a bad hire or what that person was saying was absolutely going to be wrong, and here's how I could prove it. And don't get me wrong. In most cases, I eventually then got to where, well, I just do a lot quicker. Like,
Yeah.
I would just, stop playing patty cake with reality. Stop playing games with this whole thing. You keep thinking you owe people, like, well, I don't want to hurt their feelings, or they don't feel that way about you. I'll tell you that right now. I was a fool many times in my life and my career where I'm like, I don't want to hurt their feelings. And again, I wasn't a weak guy. I just didn't want to be a quote unquote jerk. And after it's all said and done, lying to you is being the jerk, right?
Yeah.
And or playing games and pretending that you were right and so forth. It's just not worth it. If you're now how you do it's a different story, right? You do it professional or you do it in a thoughtful way. But if you know it's wrong, buckle up, go get it done, get it. You identify cancer in the body, you find it, you cut it out immediately, type of thing.
Yeah.
Do it in your life as well. I don't care if you're dating a bad girl. I don't care if you got a bad job, you got a terrible boss. Figure it. If you know it's bad, stop making excuses, make changes.
Yeah. Yeah. Amazing. Well, thank you, Mr. Don. That was a great way to end it off there. And if there's any way that people would be able to get a hold of you, how would they do so?
Yeah, sure. Again, I'm my background, we didn't really hit it, but I retired once, started in my 40s. I've been a COO, CEO, CRO. I've done lots of startups and so forth for the past 20 plus years and turnarounds, that sort of thing. Right on LinkedIn. Again, it's Don Hammond. I'm sure you'll have the names and all that kind of stuff in there.
Yep.
Right on LinkedIn.
I'll put that below.
There. Let me know, if you connect. I usually say yes to whoever connects in there. But then, throw on the Bernard Brothers thing, whatever. I get tons and tons on LinkedIn. But if we connect, you'd have my email address, my personal email address. Reach out to me that way. Guys, I know it sounds funny, but, if I can help people, I will. I do. Yeah. If you're serious about improving your life, or maybe you just need a push and some help in the right direction, I'm more than happy. I don't care if it takes 2 weeks, 2 months, or 2 years. I'm a fan of trying to help people be better. But yeah, and then if there's a bunch of Don Hammonds running around, my wife and I just left New York, so we're now in the Atlanta market. So if you go on LinkedIn and see Don Hammond, that's where it is.
Awesome. Well, folks, thank you so much. This has been Mr. Don Hammond. I'm your host of the Mind Body Business podcast, Nicholas Bernard. It's been a pleasure having you. Well, take care now.
Thank you.